Okay, hey everybody, welcome to another episode of On the Wrist from Off the Cuff. Today we have a very interesting review for you, more of a preview actually, from the brand Second Hour. A little bit about them. They're basically an upstart micro brand that are coming to Kickstarter. They were founded by a diving fanatic who goes by the name of Peter Sargison? And essentially this is of course a dive watch. Now some key common characteristics and design language. When you're looking for a dive watch, of course you're going to want water resistance, typically through some type of screw down crown. You're going to want something that's tough, legible, with a dive bezel, and if on bracelet, a diver's extension is always nice. Now this is actually going to be their first model for release from the brand Second Hour. It's called the Gin Clear Diver, and this is the Arctic White dial. Now, essentially, this diver will be launched between mid-March and early April of 2020 via Kickstarter. So now, there will be a couple of changes prior to launch. Namely, there will be high-polished bevels that are going to be added to the case, that will swoop down the lugs there, which I've actually already seen a couple of preview pictures of, which look quite nice. Of course, this is a very early prototype. The ceramic bezel will actually be brushed for a little bit less glare and more, also will help with legibility and a bit with originality as well. So that's also an interesting change. It's, of course, a bunch of other, small updates are being taken into consideration. But, things like stronger loom and just a general overall improvement in finish are planned. Now, this particular model will retail at $570 US, but you can actually get them for $385 at launch, and I think that's going to be a pretty good deal. So with all that said, let's go ahead and take a closer look. Okay. Now, as you can see, really beautiful. This dial, I would actually call it, although it's considered an Arctic kind of satiny white, it could almost pass for actually a pale silver due to that finishing on there, which is really, really quite nice. Now, of course, the specs did fly across the screen earlier in the video there, but this is about a 42.5mm diameter. Actually, if you measure from around this bezel insert, it's 40mm, so it's only slightly over your typical 40mm, but definitely wears true to size, I'd say, for a 42, very similar to something like, let's say, a Christopher Ward Trident C60, which is, definitely a very popular option as well, but of course costs a lot more. Now, the lug to lug on here is actually 49mm, so not too long there, and it does have some beautiful curved down lugs, and of course the production model will have a high polished bevel that will come down right here, so you'll also see that. This is actually just 12.5mm thick, and is of course made out of full stainless steel. It's pretty much going to be all brushed, apart from the chamfer, and then there's also a little polished beveled chamfer right there on the clasp as well. Now, as you can see just by looking at this bad boy, it does have a domed crystal. It's a domed sapphire, but it's only a single dome. So at harsh angles, you're going to see a bit of distortion, so that's going to add a little bit of play there. But it is quite an open dial, so it does remain quite legible even at pretty harsh angles. But that's also something that's on the table to change. They might actually switch it out to a flat sapphire just for better legibility overall, although this does have about 5 layers of AR coating, which you can see here. So it does a good job of mitigating those reflections as it can, but just kind of the inherent risk of any type of dome is that it's going to it's going to catch reflections. Now, the bezel itself, this is something that's also going to be tightened up for the production model. Is 120 clicks unidirectional, so let's go ahead and give it a twist here. So pretty smooth, a little bit loose, but again, this is just a prototype. So this is something that they have addressed and identified as something that will be tightened up. So there's going to be a bit of back play there, as you can see, not quite lined up. And then if I go over, it does lock in there, but there is a bit of play. But you know, that's pretty much centered right there as you have it. Now this is of course ceramic bezel insert. It will be brushed, so it's actually going to have quite a different look to it. I find that when you do they brushed, it just brings out a little bit more dimension, which is really nice. So with the light brushing that's going to be around this, it's definitely going to give it a bit more of originality, and I think also a bit more dimension on this, which this bezel insert, which is reading quite dark and quite flat at the moment. But once it has that brushing, I think it'll add some really nice dimension. So a nice touch coming to the production model there. The crown is screwed down and signed very nicely there, as you can see. Very clean with the logo. And then the movement inside here, although you can't see it because it's not a display case back or anything, it is a Swiss-made Sellita SW200. A difference for the case back is this will actually not be blasted and matte. It's going to be polished when it comes to the embossing underneath there. And you can see that we do have, of course, etched in around the outer portion of that case back. You can see some quick specs there listed. You can see everything is solid end links, solid links, you know, screw in. You can see the screw heads here. So really nice from that perspective. And milled clasp. You've seen this clasp around, and there's a reason why a lot of microbrand manufacturers choose this clasp. It's because it's a good clasp, guys. I really do enjoy having usable micro adjust holes here. It's really nice to see, and you know, I do appreciate that. I feel like there are times I think people are pressured to throw on some type of ratcheting system, and it doesn't always work. And this is something that I would rather kind of, if I had to choose, you know, I would choose this kind of over something where it doesn't give you the right amount of adjustability, or one of those big ratcheting clasps that may work really well as a diver's extension, but not really as a micro adjust, right? So I'm definitely liking that, and I think it does suit the scale and the size of the watch really, really nicely. Now, to get in about the details here on the dial, as you can see, it has that beautiful kind of balloon satin white or pale silver. It has polished hands, and then the loom is actually BGW9 Swiss Super Luminova. So you can see it is water resistant to 200 meters, which is great. And you can actually see those details that are printed on the dial are actually raised and then painted on. So it actually, for me, even increases that legibility. Almost looks extra sharp and high definition when you look at the writing there on the dial, which is really, really nice. And I think the color play is nice too, of course, with the red tipped seconds hand, and then also the red font for the depth rating. The bracelet is, of course, we got 22 millimeters at the lugs, and then the bracelet is 20 that tapers down to 20 millimeters down at the buckle. So really nice ratio there. And then, like I mentioned before, all solid with screw-in connectors, really nice. And then we do have this excellent double locking push button clasp with the micro adjust holes. So with all that said, let's go ahead and get this piece on wrist. Okay, as you can see on my 7¼ inch wrist, this thing wears really quite nicely at that 42.5 roughly. Definitely wears like a 42. Again, something comparable would be something like the C60 Trident. You can see with a little bit more of my arm here in the frame, you can get a little bit of a better idea when it comes to proportions. Definitely not oversized or anything like that, but it does have quite a large, spacious dial there, so it does render, I'd say, probably reads a little bit larger. When you get it in kind of wristy format here, where there's going to be some lens distortion. But when you get down here to this level, as you can see, it's definitely worse, you know, I think quite as you would expect. And then with the color combination there, the black bezel on the white dial, it definitely adds some really nice contrast, and I think flows really well. You can see with that very nice H-link bracelet and then the signed clasp. Everything is finished really, really quite nicely. But this is definitely a back to basics style watch. I think it definitely has very clear vintage inspired designs without it actually looking too derivative. If anything, I'd say the design does remind me a bit of the brand Zodiac. Not any particular model, but it does just have that 70s vibe to it. And if I could compare it closely to anything, that's probably what I would choose. But I think it actually does look quite nice and does wear really quite well. So you can see how the lugs just drape down and fall over the wrist, which is really, really nice. So let's actually set up some low light transition and loom shots and some closing thoughts. Okay, let's go ahead and hit the lights here. As you can see, that BGW9 loom is glowing really quite nice, but also what I like to do in these loom shots are actually set up a little bit of low light transition so you can get an idea of how this watch will actually look in less than optimal lighting. And as you can see, even in the very harsh contrasting light here that we're setting up, that brushing is actually really quite nice, and I think the play on the dial is also very much quite legible, which I do like a lot. So you're not always going to be, of course, out in you know, an open space, out in direct sunlight. At times you're of course going to be coming in at a vehicle and whatnot, indoors, outdoors, not optimal lighting. But what you can really see here is one, how those colors are going to render, how that pale silvery white dial is going to play with the light there. Also how well the contrast is going to be in that transitional, and I think you can see there with the blue hued BGW9, it does render quite nice and quite legible, even kind of in transition, where there's going to be some portions of the dial that are going to have a lot of light on them and some that are going to be quite dim. Also, you can look at the brushing on here, and what you're going to see is actually it's going to expose, because of the more harsher kind of lighting and the higher contrast here, you're going to see a lot of imperfections exposed. And I think that in this case, that finish looks pretty good on that brushing there. So really nice. I mean, nothing to the level I'd say luxury or anything like that, but I think it actually looks really quite nice as far as finishing goes, and it is kind of what you would expect from a watch in this price range. And I don't mean at the launch pricing under 400 bucks at 385. I'm talking something that's closer to the $600 mark at the full retail of 570. So some closing thoughts on the wrist. You know, I think this wears, again, very similar to the Trident C60, but it definitely has a more classics, you know, kind of traditional aesthetic to it. It's very much back to basics take on a dive watch as far as the aesthetic goes, and I really dig that. It definitely has a 70s vibe, and I think actually the production changes that they have planned are going to make this watch stand out even more. Now, as far as model variants go, there's a black sand model. Basically, all of these, just to mention, will have black bezels, but then different color dials. So there's a black sand, which is a gilt dial. So instead of having kind of those high polished silver accents you're seeing here, they're going to be gold. There's also a pastel blue, and then a cream sand, which is also a gilt dial option as well. And again, they'll all be paired with the black, so I think it's going to have some nice contrast and really give this some nice personality. And it's also going to be a little easier because they're not going to have to chase down trying to color match each one of those bezels. So I think that's pretty smart play on their part, and it also does keep the cost down. Now, you know, comparable models, it's tough, right? This is just an extremely flooded range. Dive watches under, you know, around, I'd say under 1,000, but over 500. That is a heavily crowded space. And, you know, props to Peter for, you know, I think putting some really fun and cool, interesting ideas into the space to try to bring essentially a really cool, new, fun dive watch option. So although, yeah, it is an extremely competitive market, you know, although I'd say micro brand divers tend to be a dime a dozen in that space, one that feels this classic without feeling equally derivative is not common at all. So as crowded as things are, I think this design aesthetic, this level of execution, you know, a real combination, I think it really helps the gin clear diver make itself a standout in a sea of other options that are out there. But definitely let me know what you guys think in the comments below. If you like the video, please do a like. If you haven't already, please subscribe for more content just like this. Thanks, guys.